Hi everyone, welcome to South by Southwest. I know it's one of the earlier sessions, so I'm excited to be here. My name's Kayla Jimenez and I'm a reporter with USA Today. I specialize in covering education, so I'm really excited to be having this conversation with these lovely panelists, especially because we're talking about middle school career education. A lot of what I've been covering are the student loan debt crisis has been a big thing in the news. I think a lot of students and schools are rethinking how they're talking to their students about career education and what pathways there are after high school. And I think sometimes we start in high school where we're going to talk about what we want to do now at the end of senior year, junior year, but I think there's sort of an innovation that we're going to talk about today, starting in middle school earlier. So I'm excited to introduce my panelists. I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves, if that's okay, and then talk a little bit about yourself and where you're from.
Great. Thank you so much, Kayla. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Lammers. I'm the Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Corporate Social Responsibility for American Student Assistance. We are a national nonprofit that focuses on ensuring all young people have the opportunity to explore careers at an early age and then chart a course to education and career success. And our work, we focus on how we provide more opportunity for young people as early as middle school to begin to start thinking about careers. And in the high school years, really test and try those that learned knowledge about themselves and what they're interested in through work-based learning, through internships and project-based learning, and then help them think really critically about how that leads to long-term education and career opportunities for them. So I focus on our advocacy and policy work, as well as our philanthropic giving. We do a lot of work to try to change policies at both the state and federal level around what is possible for young people and what opportunities exist. And then on the philanthropy side, really trying to support organizations that are doing this work well to ensure that every young person has opportunity around career exploration and career-connected learning.
Hi, Paul Herdman, and I run an organization called Rodell, which is based in Wilmington, Delaware. And we sit at this intersection between education and the economy. We work to, what we say is convene, connect, and scale transformational ideas in those spaces. And part of the framing for me really comes as being a former teacher. I don't know if we'll get into this, but in terms of why we're doing this work, it really comes for me in sort of a twofold frame. One is that my dad was raised in a single family household, first generation college goer, and it really changed his life. So school was important, right, from the beginning. But then I became a teacher in New York City, where I worked in a school where 90% of the kids were not making it through. And we were able to create a program that was built on the Outward Bound model. And in essence, we had 90% actually making it through and going on to college, career, et cetera. And for me, that was a realization that the system was messed up and not the kids. And so have worked to pursue that work. And so another role I play, in addition to running this nonprofit, is I chair the strategic planning committee for our workforce development board. So I try and connect the dots in that way as well.
Thanks. I'm excited to be on the stage with you and excited to be with you all today. My name is Danielle Ongart. I'm the Executive Director of the Student Pathways Unit at the Colorado Department of Education. And I'm here to share a little bit about some of the investments that we've made in middle school and high school career advising. We've made some pretty historic investments recently, and also we are really prioritizing stakeholder input, including students, families, focus groups in multiple languages, and really trying to make sure we're hearing from folks that are the most directly impacted. And then on a personal note, I'm here for similar reasons. I'm a first-generation college student and also a first-generation high school graduate. My father grew up on a rural farm in Thailand, and my mom went to a career fair and figured out that she wanted to work for the government well before she was able to graduate from high school. So none of my grandparents went to college, and I had kind of a tough time figuring out what to do and how to make sure that college investment that my family ultimately made in me was able to result in now me being this government bureaucrat, if you will. But hopefully I can bring a little levity for that and explain some of the great things that we're doing. So thank you.
Thank you, and I look forward to learning from you all today. The top line of the panel today is about state policy and practice that can change the way that students think about their futures. And Julie, I know American Student Assistance has done some research on the ways that different states are approaching this. And I would love to hear from you some top-line research, best practices and policies that you've seen, and if you want to give us an overview of the most striking findings of the research, that would be great.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. So yes, we just conducted a research survey that is out today. It's available at asa.org for those that are interested. We did this work in collaboration with Education Strategy Group, and our focus was really to try to understand how states are both implementing policy and what policies really exist around middle school career exploration, because it's fairly new in most places, and we wanted to get an understanding of what is happening well, and as states begin to build systems around career exploration, what should they be thinking about as they move down this path. So we conducted this survey, as I said, with Education Strategy Group. We looked at 13 different categories over 3 main areas of policy, infrastructure, and state vision to try to understand what states were doing. Every policy was looked at, that we looked at things that the leaders of the states were saying and how that was translating into policy, what was happening on the ground in all of these states, how funding systems were set up, what data collection systems were set up. What we found broadly was that a large number of states, about 72% of states, actually do have policies around career exploration. Where we found the biggest challenge was that only about 20% of states are actually tracking data or understand the quality of those programs. And the thing that was starkest for us was when we actually asked students what was happening, because we know that there is a huge disconnect between policy and what's actually happening on the ground. And what we were seeing from students was that while they talked, these policies may exist, they are generally seeing them as paper and pencil exercises in schools, may happen once a week, one day out of the year. They talk about it, they move on, and then it's never mentioned again. And so that's how a lot of these policies are actually translating. What young people are saying they want is hands-on experiences. They say that by and large, they're still largely learning about careers from their families, which we know is limiting when it comes to the access that families have to social capital and certain careers. And so there's a huge disconnect between what we're seeing in this sort of nascent stage of policy development in the states and what's actually translating into schools. So I think we are happy to see that there are a lot of states that are talking about this as a real priority issue for them, that leaders are saying this is something we need to do, but there is a huge disconnect in how they're actually doing it at the moment. And so the upside is there's a lot of progress that can be made, lots of room for improvement, and we will try to help states see where some of those best practices are that are happening in states. The report that we put out not only has a summary of all of this work, but Education Strategy Group broke down by state, 4 pages for each state, exactly where their policies lie and where there are opportunities to make some changes in that way. So we're hopeful that it'll be a very useful resource to states as they're thinking about what they can do and where precisely they can lean in to make some change over the next months and years.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we can pull it back and explain what middle school career actually looks like on the ground, what they're aspiring, and why American Student Assistance decided to do this research now.
Sure. Yeah. So this has always been a priority issue for us. So ASA is really focused on ensuring that young people have the opportunity to explore careers at a much earlier age. We see fundamentally that if young people don't have exposure to careers, by the time they get towards the end of middle school, they've already started foreclosing opportunities for themselves. So this is not about having someone pick in middle school what they want to do. It really is, how do we expand the vast variety of possibilities available to them, help them think about some key things, including what they're good at, what they like, what the world will pay them for, and what the world needs. And somewhere in the connection of those four things really is something that they will be able to thrive at, and we try to help them uncover what that myriad of career possibilities are based on those sort of key factors. So really trying to think of how do we expand opportunity for young people at an earlier age. They're not foreclosing opportunities, providing them with the chance to see things that they might not have experienced in their community or in their family, opening up that social capital to them so that they can start thinking differently about what's possible for themselves, is really critical at a middle school age when they're still much more open to exploration. Young people have not yet started to stress about the future, which tends to happen in later high school years, and so they are much more open to what are the possibilities for me. So that's one of the reasons that we really focus on middle school. And then we like to think about the trajectory from middle school and how do those experiences in middle school, the opportunity to understand a little bit more about yourself and where you fit in the world in middle school, how can we then take much more in-depth actions in high school to let them explore some of those things, whether it's project-based learning or an internship or an entrepreneurial experience, and really start to narrow down their career identity and think more critically then about what the post-secondary education and career path might be for them, based on understanding what they like, what they love, what they hate, through hands-on experiences, internships, those types of things. But really starting those middle school years is really critically important to begin that journey of self-discovery and really, as we say, sort of lengthen that runway for what understanding those possibilities are. We're starting those conversations far too late right now in the education journey for most young people to really take advantage of opportunities that are available to them.
And I'm glad we have two education leaders from very different states here to tell us what they're doing in their states and what middle school career exploration means there. So we'll start with you, Paul. How are things going in Delaware?
Sure, and it's probably helpful. A lot of people probably, I can't really see people, but many of you probably have maybe passed through Delaware on your way up 95, but don't really know it very well. It's a pretty small state, and just to give you a quick context, because Colorado is a much more complex, bigger state. So it's 2 hours top to bottom, about 1 million people, only 140,000 students within the system. So we could work with all of our middle grade students, in a relatively short order. We're going to try and get there in the next several years, but that's about 30,000 students. But the interesting thing for Delaware is that it's just as diverse as the country. There's more kids of color than not. Our special ed numbers are similar, et cetera. And the politics are, while they lean left, the home of Joe, they are just as crazy as any place else. It's polarized, red to blue. So it's a microcosm, and the advantage is that we could potentially move a little faster. So the example of that is, I mentioned that we convene, connect, and scale transformational change. We've been on this journey around pathways for about a decade, and I'll sort of just give you the quick overview of how that's gone and how it sort of ties back into why we got into the middle grades level. So about 10 years ago, we were actually facing a crisis in the state. It was on the heels of the economic downfall of 2009 to about 2011. And being a very small state, our economy is kind of like New Zealand. It's pretty fragile. If we lose one major company, we are in trouble. If we were in New York or maybe even Colorado, we'd be much more sort of flexible, but we're not. And so our major employers said, hey, we need to deal with this like ASAP in terms of the pipeline of folks. And so we went with educators from our Department of Education and business leaders to go visit Finland, Singapore, Switzerland, Germany, et cetera, to try and learn from the best in the world. And we came back and partnered with a national intermediary, Jobs for the Future, and built out a strategic plan, building off of one pilot with 27 students with one of our regular high schools, a community college, and a advanced manufacturing firm. 27 students, one pathway. Long story short, that was sort of the convening piece of this. We got the governor involved, the business people, et cetera. the connecting side was then we connected to some national resources like ASA, Bloomberg Foundation, Walden Foundation, others, and also some federal dollars to scale it. So now we have about 30,000 students. About 65% of our students are in our high schools are involved in career pathways, which for us means three things: a meaningful work-based learning experience, access to an industry-recognized credential, and up to 15 college credits. So we're at a bit of a scale, and this is sort of the transition back to the middle grades. One of the things we realize is that we do actually do a decent job, our department does, on looking at how students are placed. And there's actually a nice case study by Bellwether about this that goes into much more detail than it's in the resources. But basically, we were able to say, hey, we're doing a pretty decent job in terms of the representation of students in pathways. But then we actually looked at the completion rates, and we realized that the completion rates as it related to the high demand jobs did not reflect the diversity of our students in the way it should. And whether it's gender, race, et cetera. And so part of what we realized is that if we back up, these students are not really able to make informed choices and are kind of on a tram ride, from 9th grade on, that they may not realize. And I'll just give you one last concrete example, and I'll pass it on. But one of my colleagues is Kelsey in the audience, and I won't call her out specifically. I did call her out, but I won't make her stand up or anything. But one of her colleagues that's working with her on this is Kim. And Kim is brilliant, first generation college goer, lived nearest to the vocational school in her neighborhood. And even though she wanted to go to grad school, was suggested to go to her local vocational school. Unfortunately, some random teacher said, hey, what do you want to do later? And she said, well, I want to go on to grad school, maybe go to Penn, University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And she said, you have the grades to kind of move in that direction, but going to the local vocational school, it's great, but you're not going to get the courses that you need in order to prepare you to go to college. Fortunately, she went to just the comprehensive high school. She did amazing. She went on to Penn, et cetera. But had she not just randomly run into that teacher, she would have been on a very different path. And so part of what really drives our work around the middle grades is equity, that we're sort of creating a system that not only in high school, but in career, does not reflect the diversity of our community, and we need every single person to maximize their potential. So if we could back it up a little bit, we felt like we could provide students with sort of a mix of the self-efficacy agency by looking at how they were ready, what a high school ready student would actually look like. And I can go into that process in more depth, but we actually kind of backward map from that to build out some standards and a strategy and some pilots, and I'll expound on that, but that's where we ended up.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, Danielle, I'd love to hear how things are going in Colorado.
Great, thank you. Yes, as you mentioned, Colorado is a bit bigger. We have approximately 900,000 students, about 60,000 students per grade level in Colorado, 178 school districts, and we're pretty purple. So we definitely have lots of Democrats, lots of Republicans, also have lots of Libertarians, and so we really firmly believe in local control and making sure that the decisions are made, hopefully, by the folks that are impacted and most closely related to those decisions. And so from the Colorado lens, from the state level, we try to provide some frameworks. We try to provide some free tools and resources, and then also to provide opportunities to hear from educators, industry, students and families about how those are working for them and how to improve them. So we do have a couple of frameworks that I think are particularly helpful in the middle grades conversation. One is a work-based learning continuum. It's written into our Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act state plan, our CTE Perkins state plan, and it shows these three big buckets: learning about work, learning at work, and learning through work. And so with the learning about work, that's kind of where we're focusing in the middle grades. So we've got the bulleted list: career coaching, career planning, career fairs, presentations, et cetera. But we also have some quality standards related to those, as well as some best practices and playbooks. So that way we can help school counselors and educators actually do that in the middle grades with their students. We also had a multi-million-dollar investment from our state legislature in career advising. So we have created a career advising framework. We invite not just educators and school counselors, but really anybody who works with students as well as with higher education and workforce to participate in these trainings. It's a pretty simple framework. It just has 3 pieces: engage, explore, and empower. But we offer that to everybody throughout the state. And then there are resources related to that. So we do have a statewide platform called My Colorado Journey that has a lot of labor market information on there. It has career pathways information. And the goal is that we are providing that to students and families so they can see, if I'm interested in this career, how much money am I going to make? Which I think is pretty important for decision making. So we have these resources, but we found that middle schoolers were not really using the platform. And so we worked with this grant program that we got from the legislature to provide a now career tool that middle school students are able to take. It's much more visually friendly. The language is more friendly. Frankly, it's just cooler than some of the other career interest inventory surveys that we've had on the platform. And we've really seen a great uptick with both middle school and high school students taking it. And what's great is it's not just, hey, these are the kinds of things I'm interested in, this is what I'm passionate about, which we know Gen Z really cares about, right? Having that values base. But then at the end, it shows you not just the careers, but it also shows you job descriptions for current roles like that. And it is related also to that labor market information, so that way students can see that financial pieces. So instead of students having to click around multiple places or try to go to their educator and then school counselor, hopefully it's all in one place. And it's also accessible to families. So we know that some parents have taken it as well and are able to do that kind of alongside with their student, which has been really great to make sure that the whole family is involved. So happy to talk about any more of those resources, and I believe that they are linked in the app as well.
Yeah, great. Well, I look forward to coming back and asking you a few more questions about that. But I'm going to come back to Julie, because I know this analysis looked at all the states, and I want to know what states are doing well and what barriers are some states facing.
Yeah, so I think there are, every state is at a different stage. And so we didn't necessarily rank the states. We sort of, over the 13 categories, ESG went through and put them into stages of building, emerging, and advanced based on 13 different criteria. And so it really is looking at things very specifically, like the basics of, do you have a definition of career exploration? Do you track data? Do you have training programs in place? So there are, looking at the report, you can see that there are some states that are doing specific things very, very well. And then there are some areas where they still are lagging on. No, I don't think we came across any state that is doing everything perfectly. We still have a lot of room for improvement with a lot of things. Besides Colorado and Delaware, of course.
Yeah.
They're doing everything perfectly. So, I think there are definitely things that we need to be focusing on across the board, and I think the biggest one is that data collection piece. We don't have a good sense of what program quality looks like in most states. Only about 20% of states actually track data on their career exploration activities. And so it's hard to say what is actually happening on the ground in a classroom when we don't have data, and it's not necessarily tied to accountability systems. Some states are doing that fairly well. They have included them in their ESSA accountability plans, and so they are constantly looking back and saying, this is something we are willing to hold ourselves accountable going forward. There's only a handful of states that are doing that, though. So when it comes to big policy and ideas around career exploration, I think a lot of states are there. They're on board with the idea that this is something that needs to happen. When it comes to actually putting it in place and holding states accountable for it, that's where we have the largest way to go to make sure that states are doing a strong job there.
And what are the barriers that states are facing?
So there are some basic policy barriers that are still in place. So when you think about, for example, in 2018, the federal government opened up Perkins 5 funding to be for an allowable use for middle school career exploration. For the first time, federal funds could go into the middle school grades. Well, a number of states had in policy in their states that Perkins funding started in 9th grade. So there are states that need to go back. There are still some states that need to go back and address basic policy issues in their legislature to extend that allowable use of federal funds into middle school. So there are things there that each state needs to look at to understand, are there actually policies in place that are prohibiting our ability to either access funds or do this across the board?
Yeah, I know that funding was a key point in the findings.
Yeah, and Delaware, I think we sort of called out Delaware as an example of how they have very strategically tapped into many sources of funding to get their project off the ground. Federal funding, state funding, philanthropic funding. So I don't know, Paul, if you want to talk a little bit more about how that works.
Well, I'd love to hear about the model that Delaware is following and overcoming any of those barriers.
Yeah. Sure. So maybe just to kind of reiterate one of the findings real quick. I have 3 kids who are now through school, and they had a sort of a framework that they were supposed to fill out about their career, and like I asked each of them about it, and they're like, I don't remember doing that, so I think the reality of just doing some kind of rote exercise without sort of the deeper follow-up, I think is consistent with your findings. But anyway, in terms of the big picture, we started this work around 2014, and we got to Pathways 1.0. We kind of got about 9,000 students engaged, and we had a good start, but we wanted to get to a much higher percentage. And so we put together a comprehensive plan, and this is for those who might be intermediaries in the audience, folks who kind of connect the dots between public and private players, which is kind of what we see ourselves doing. What we wanted to do is, even though we have some of our own resources, we're an operational foundation, we wanted to build a bigger nest egg to do something more comprehensive. And rather than going out to individual funders to say, hey, I think you're interested in this, can we develop an individual plan? We talked to our stakeholders and basically said, what would the next generation of this need to look like to be successful? What would wild success look like in the next 3 years? And we came up with what felt like a pretty big plan, about a $15 million plan. And we had not really raised near that much money before. And so we went out to a range of funders, the Bloomberg Foundation, ASA, Walden, et cetera. And they were able to put together about half of that. And then we were able to go to our state, our governor, and say, there's all this ARPA money, can we marry that to that? And then we also have some local corporate funders, about 20 of them, who on a smaller scale have contributed to that as well. But having Bank of America, DuPont, et cetera, at the table with us is helpful in terms of building out work placements as well as their investments. So we came up with this comprehensive strategy, and a piece of that was around the middle grades work, which obviously is ASA's focus. So that's how that sort of came together. One thing I just would maybe want to throw out, just building on the research piece of it, could I throw out? Because there's a body of research that I think ESG, Education Strategy Group, did a great job of laying it out, but for those who are interested, there's, the nerds of the, around this stuff. It was interesting. When I was taking my Uber ride in, he's like, "You going to Southwest, South by Southwest?" And I was like, "Well, we're going to kind of the nerdy part of South by Southwest." It's sort of like the cool part starts on Thursday.
I don't think anyone here is offended by that.
No. So the cool part starts on Thursday, but this is still we still count, right? But part of my role, I got a chance to do some work in partnership with the OECD, the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is based in Europe and does international research. And there's research that corroborates your work, which I think is just helpful. There's a whole body of work in a group called Career Readiness. So if you just look up OECD / Career Readiness, they did looked at 10 countries over 10 years and looked at what factors impacted their future life outcomes. And so at 15, if they were able to think about, explore and experience career readiness efforts, very similar to your framework. They had better life outcomes in terms of wages, college access, et cetera, or just sort of broader escalation of their careers. So there is a broader body of research that basically echoes the notion of doing all these things that may be helpful as you think about digging into this work.
Great. And Danielle, what model does Colorado follow, and how is the state overcoming some of the barriers that Julie had mentioned?
Absolutely, thank you. So I'm pretty proud to say that our career and technical education programs have expanded to the middle grades. We have 153 programs across the state. It's almost every school district. And the majority of them, 89 of them, are the more kind of general career exploration, which is very exciting. After that, there's 21 programs in agriculture. And so clearly the career exploration, there's really been an uptick in that since Perkins was able to expand that funding. So that's been really exciting. And out of that, we've been able to provide some very tangible resources. We've got a series of sentence and conversation starters based on grade levels. So that's pretty great. We've heard a lot from our school counselors that was helpful as they're building and expanding these programs. But in terms of barriers, in Colorado, we've got, I think, at least 15 post-secondary workforce readiness related programs, and they're out of 4 different state agencies. For example, our career and technical education is run out of our community college system, not out of the state educational agency, which frankly, we think actually helps pretty significantly with CTE, ensuring that we've got qualified instructors, as well as having that very clear and direct connection for students to post-secondary. But, we're all trying to manage different things from different funding sources, serve different folks. And so we recently, our state legislature created a task force. We call it the 1215 Task Force because that was the bill, but it's the Secondary, Post-Secondary, and Work-Based Learning Integration Task Force, which is why we call it the 1215 Task Force, because it's so long. I never get it right usually. But we spent 18 months talking to students and families, industry professionals, and educators, and the task force members came out with a series of recommendations. There are 13 legislative recommendations. And the main crux and point is exactly what you were saying earlier, that we want to make sure that all students, by the time that they're 21, have access for free to 3 things: college credit attainment, work-based learning, and industry-recognized credential attainment. So exactly on the same page. And then the recommendations get into having a single source of information online that is even more robust than what we may currently have, talking about making sure that we're involving middle school students, et cetera. So I think we've identified a fair number of barriers, some of which is just, this is a lot of stuff and it's kind of complicated for people to take advantage of. Also, when we talk to kids, they don't care about what program it is. They have no idea, really what the name is or the funding source or this or that. And then we had principals coming with a binder full of one-pagers that they would share with families, which, that's too complicated. So we're trying to simplify, we're trying to umbrella, and we're also trying to create a statewide longitudinal data system, hopefully. That was one of the recommendations. So that way we can then really, truly track this in a way that could be meaningful and hopefully will help to inform the students and families.
Can I also, one of the things that Colorado does really well, the grant program that you've put out around training. Training for counselors and teachers is a huge barrier that a lot of states are struggling with. I think we have seen early on a lot of career exploration programs are sort of a pet project of a particular teacher that's really passionate about it. And so one of the questions is, how do you make that passion statewide? How do you make sure that every district and every student has access to that? And there's not a lot when it comes to teacher training that is being done to make sure that the teachers have resources to incorporate this work into things that are already happening, because no one has more time in the day to build in something else. So how do you add it on to the high quality, make sure it's a high quality program and add it into things that teachers are doing already, and really train teachers and support them as they're trying to build that infrastructure for their schools. So I don't know if you want to talk about how the Colorado grant is working?
Absolutely. Yes. So 4 years ago, it was during COVID, that was the first time the legislature wanted to invest. And so we were able to get a vendor and create the career advising framework. So we started trainings. We were planning on training 5,000 people. Because of COVID, I think we only got to 3,000, but I think that's still a pretty significant number. And so we started out with in-person and then also online, both synchronous and asynchronous trainings. And then 2 years later, we got an additional investment. So we were able to go back to the same vendor, modify, update it, make it a little bit, I think, friendlier, frankly, the second time around. And so now there are trainings that are going on across the state. We're also working to do some train the trainer models with our individualized career and academic plan facilitators that we've got that are throughout the state. And then having the online training as well. But again, just having the resource available, and there's a common message across all of the different state agencies that this is not it's not just for a school counselor, it's not just for an educator. Of course, those are important audiences, but we want bus drivers to come, we want principals to come. We also want higher education advisors to attend, workforce professionals. So also, throughout, hopefully, someone's career journey in Colorado, they're getting that high quality advising, and are also getting exposure and practice with some of the most important tools that contain that labor market information, that contain the cost information for training in higher education. And so also that they can become familiar and manipulate them as they need to then help them throughout their path.
Great. And Danielle, I'm glad you mentioned that students don't really care about these big words that we're using. So what does it look like on the ground if I'm a middle schooler who is not sure what I want to do going forward? I would love to hear from, we'll start with you, Danielle.
Yeah, great question. I will say that we don't necessarily have, we are trying to reduce the school counselor to student ratio in Colorado. We have a school counselor core grant program that helps to pay for school counselor FTE at schools. And I think that we are close to the ASCA 250 to 1 school counselor ratio in the schools that have that grant. But I will admit, it's not that every single middle school, unfortunately, has a school counselor at this point. So we are trying to figure out with some cost studies how we could do that as a state and whether or not we want the legislature to put that information to the legislature to see if they want to prioritize that. But we think it's not just school counselors, it's really also the educators, and then infusing it into the Colorado academic standards. So part of our academic standards are our essential skills, and then also our work-based learning continuum that we try to really put out in front of the educators, so that way we can say, hey, what are the ways that you're connecting your careers throughout all of the academics? We're about to embark on revising our essential skills using some public input, as well as revising our individualized career and academic plan state board rules. We're just really doing a lot, and so we're working to make sure that things are better embedded in the state standards as we are doing this whole revision. There's icons, there's footnotes, there's things that connect it, but it's not necessarily fully integrated at that standards level, and so that I think is the next big phase of work that we'll be undertaking.
Great.
Paul, just provide a little more context. So if you think about how you change systems, our system is, one of the few things that looks fairly similar to what it did 100 years ago, maybe 1,000, but 100 years ago anyway. It's very difficult to change. And the way we tend to do it is either through piloting something and then seeing if that works and then trying to scale it, or we try from the upside, the policy side and say, all right, we're going to create this environment and then hope that the implementation is good. You kind of need both, right? You need the policy environment that enables, and then you need strong implementation. And so I would say we started from the bottom up. So the way this has worked for us, we're 2.5 years into this. The first 2 years was really design and stakeholder engagement. So we started with, all right, so what does a high school ready student need to look like? And we had a broad stakeholder engagement group that included employers, educators, et cetera, folks who were actually one of the teachers we had, for example, was in one of our teacher academies in the career pathways. But we had some veteran teachers as well. And we had students, of course, throughout this process. That steering committee developed that definition, then built out based on the domains of that, which I would say strongly align with what you were saying. So it's kind of a combination of sort of the academics, social emotional learning, and career readiness kind of merged together. And we have 6 domains. You can look at it online, and there are standards in relation to that. And now what we're doing is saying, all right, now we have a high-level definition, we have sort of some standards, and we then piloted, we did a fairly rigorous review process to identify 10 schools. And we're now in the process, 6 months in, of implementing with each of them. And they have very different approaches, but part of the criteria was that they had to have students engaged in this, that there was an equity framework that all of them had to engage in and support. And this is very much a student-led and teacher-led design process from the ground up. And so in terms of what this looks like, I'll just give you one example from one of the charter schools. It's called Kumba Academy. It's in downtown Wilmington. It's an arts-based school. And they sort of went through this 3-part process for grades 5 through 7 that they're now engaging in. But one was sort of an exploration of self and sort of how they fit in, and also what their parents do to kind of understand, like kind of build on that community and use them as resources. And then the second phase was, because they are arts related, they started to figure out what are the arts related careers that sort of fit into what they might be interested in. They did some exploration, engaged with some folks in those spaces, and then they had projects they had to develop. So one project was to actually do a production where they intentionally worked on different roles or occupations within that production, and really had some active conversations about what that entailed, and then dug deeper with folks who were adults who were doing those types of things. They're also looking at, for example, a campaign around the environment, and then using their arts-related careers in terms of communications, production, et cetera, that would go into those. In their 8th grade year, they're going to be doing more direct experience, like internships and things like that, job shadowing, et cetera. So it's early days, but I'd say the big thing that we're trying to work towards is have this student-driven, teacher-driven design process, building off a common set of standards, but that from that we're going to develop an implementation strategy or a set of strategies that folks can build on. But candidly, I see this as an iterative process. It's going to continue to grow. I mentioned to Julie early on that I got a chance to go up to British Columbia, and they have a K through 12 career readiness curriculum, and they started it in 2011. And I talked to the equivalent of their commissioner of education, and she said, we're still evolving. You know, we're still, like every year we kind of tweak it and evolve, and it gets better and stronger. So I see this as an ongoing process, but that's a bit of how it looks on the ground.
And I'd say one of the things that's unique about the process that they undertook in Delaware, and that we saw in our research, was that they are making sure there is no disconnect between what the students are saying and what the policy is that they're trying to implement. Right. You know, the research really focused quite a bit on how policies are being translated to students and what they're feeling about the policies that have been implemented, and that they are not experiencing them in the way that anyone envisioned or would like to ultimately see. So Delaware has really taken a very deliberate approach to say, what do students want and need? How are they being heard in this process? And how are they part of this journey with us? So really.
Well, and I might build on it a little bit in the sense that it's a very difficult mindset shift, right? And so you mentioned about challenges, you know, and I'd say that mindset shift is difficult, and it takes time, you know, and the professional development you're offering is amazing. And so I think part of the challenge is that even if you have a group of educators who want to go from point A to point B, and they understand point B is important, you know, a much more integrated, sort of amazingly engaging, student-driven middle school experience, they don't know how to get from point A to point B. And and also the incentives in the system are still largely driven around sort of academics, et cetera. They're not really kind of incentivized to do anything different. And yeah, so there's this tension between sort of the world that we live in, the world we want to get to, and how do you support folks in that change management process. So I would actually add that to our, I mean, I think you alluded to it, but I mean, just name it, that change management is a huge part of this, and really providing the time and support needed to help people move along the journey.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, this takeaway of asking students what they're feeling and what their communities are doing, what their parents have done, is an interesting way to look at it, rather than what do you want to do and we're going to go on this path. Yeah. I think we touched on equity a few times here. Danielle, I'm glad that you brought up that not every school, not every district has a counselor. How are your states ensuring equity to resources in this area? And what barriers are there in that as well? Because I'm interested in whether low-income or high-income schools are getting this access over another school district. So I'm curious to hear from both of you.
I can try to start.
Sure.
I think there's a couple of tactical pieces and like translating things, honestly. So making sure that any websites that we are building or other materials that we're building, especially if they're remotely parent-facing, are translated into at least 5, if not more languages, because we clearly have more than 5 in the state. So making sure that parents are really a part of it has been pretty important. And so it's trying now to find and prioritize the resources to make sure that that's able to happen. And that's why I'm like so proud that we were able to do some focus groups in multiple languages with students and families, because it's so we've got to hear from all of our parents. And then I think in Colorado right now, it's a lot of carrots, frankly. And so we have a number of grant programs. The Student Pathways unit itself oversees 40 competitive grant programs. And so a lot of what we do in Colorado is we say, okay, well, we see that there's a need. So in some ways, we're going to consider this grant a pilot. So we're going to offer this, see, how many folks are applying for how much. What really are the things that they're trying to focus on, and then hopefully, if we see that it's something that is really truly needed and important, then the legislature can see that and provide some additional funding for that. Of course, we also look to federal funding sources like Perkins, and then also, when possible, some philanthropic funding, so that way we can at least really bolster the pilots. But I'm not going to pretend and say that we are super far along and that every student in our state has equal access to all of these opportunities, because they don't. But that was also the focus of that task force that I mentioned. We really, really do want to make sure that students have access, especially in our rural areas, because of course there's some challenges there too.
Yeah, I started out my comments that equity was really how we got started on this whole middle school journey. We've been looking at the data, and you could look at, I mentioned I chair workforce development, the Workforce Development Board's strategic planning efforts, and you can see the same sort of demographic inequities that exist. We actually started an organization called the Tech Council of Delaware, and one of the things that they're trying to do is actually build a more inclusive tech pipeline by intentionally trying to build more women and folks of color into that space. But as it relates to the middle grades work, I think part of what we're trying to do is better prepare young people to take agency and sort of control their own decision making, because there is some implicit biases that folks may not even see. There are folks, if you were to go to a particular school, and some of our staff and myself have gone to them, where they say there is no bias in our school. We look at every kid the same way, but then we look at sort of the distribution of where kids are in their coursework. It doesn't reflect that. And so I'm not sure if this is part of the suite of professional development that you alluded to, but some of the schools that are part of the pilot are doing implicit bias training. There are also additional resources around special needs students and students of color, trying to get more students into fields that they're underrepresented in. But we're looking at this middle grades piece as sort of a foundational start to having students sort of drive this conversation from the ground up.
I think one of the additional things that is so important when we're thinking about equity is, do we understand who is participating in the programs? And the lack of data that we have available on most of these programs makes it really hard to understand where those inequities exist. And so once states can be pushed to try to think differently about what they're being held accountable for and what they're tracking, we will have a better sense of how they can drive policy to ensure they're not actually creating more inequity. And that these programs are being used as a way to help some of the inequities that we see.
Julie, I'm curious, because you talk about the lack of data, do you anticipate there being more data in the future? Are there any state lawmakers or leaders talking about collecting data? Yeah,
absolutely there are, and there are a handful of states that are actually doing it. Pennsylvania does it fairly well. They have it included in their ESSA accountability systems. A few other states, Michigan, Utah, there are states that are doing it, but it's just not universal yet. And I think it's because the programs are so new and they're being built sometimes classroom by classroom, if not school by school. And they're not generally statewide frameworks yet for what the standards are. It's really hard to hold schools accountable for them at the moment. So very few people are collecting that data. We're hopeful that that's the direction states will move in, but we have a ways to go.
Got it. And I'm curious, because both of you have put so much work into this area, what is the ideal? Your state has all the resources and students are prepared, or what is the ideal?
I mean, for us, that it would be consistent with that high school ready profile that I alluded to and is in the resources, that every student is walking, and isn't ideal, walking into high school informed about what their choices are, but most importantly, understanding themselves. I mean, it's as much about who you are as much as what you want to do or be. And so a good understanding of that, as well as what the career opportunities are, et cetera, so that they can make an informed choice to start that process. We're not expecting kids at 14 to know what they want to do. There are systems around the world that start folks in that space, but I think we want to just help young people position themselves to make good choices and be prepared to really own their own journey. So the structure of that, we're building it. And part of what we're trying to do now is through these pilots is sort of say, all right, let's build out what this could look like organically. From this, we're going to start to build out the frameworks that we're going to scale. And the other piece of this in terms of a barrier is around funding. So one of the things that we're looking to in terms of policy change is there are CT funds, for example, right now in Delaware that are available for 7th and 8th graders, but people don't really use it for that. And we're looking to pass some legislation which would modestly move that needle down to 5th and 6th grade. So we could actually have those resources available. And we already know Perkins is available, but again, we're not utilizing it in that way. So there are some organic sort of design pieces that we're working on that would really reflect that high school ready student. And then there are some structural policy changes around funding and scale that we're working through.
Got it. Danielle?
Yes, so somewhat similar. The task force that I mentioned earlier, the recommendations were organized into 4 buckets, and I think that really helps to set the vision. And so the first is program modernization. It would be easy for a student, a family member, for a principal, a school district, all to take advantage of the available funding at the state level, and it would be really easy for them to report those data, so not duplicative reporting. We would have a statewide longitudinal data system that would connect all that information. The second bucket was access and awareness, so it's making sure that students and families have what they need, the information they need, a single source of information, as well as advising, and hopefully some tech-enabled tools that could make sure that the time as students are spending with humans is really focused and helpful, and that some of the other things that may or may not be a little bit more checkboxy could hopefully be taken care of maybe by AI, intrusive advising via text message, things like that. The third bucket of recommendations, funding, consistent, reliable, guaranteed. And so we are undertaking an effort to see how we could fund based on those 3 outcomes, college credit, work-based learning, and industry-recognized credentials. We do that in various ways, piecemeal, but not holistically. And then lastly, the partnerships, which not last but not least, of course. So community-based organizations, out-of-school time programs, intermediaries, obviously our business community, all of that would need to be coming together and kind of be all on the same page about what we want for the youth in our state. And then lastly, I think we're trying to take a really overall ecosystems approach, so we can tell students there's no wrong door, there's multiple pathways. We want you to be able to pursue what you're good at and what you value. But if we don't do things like skills-based hiring as a state, then that's not going to help, right? I mean, students can only get it only to a certain point. So I do think we're also trying to work in particular with our Colorado Workforce Development Council to look at the entire ecosystem. And we've got executive orders from our governor about skills-based hiring and also increasing apprenticeships. So I think that helps, so that way when students are to the point where they're getting those jobs, those things are available to them.
So I'll just add, one other thing that some states have done. I know in Utah, for example, there is actually a requirement that 7th and 8th graders take a college and career readiness class. It is taught in sort of collaboration between a work-based learning a teacher, a school counselor, and the CTE teachers. So it's really a team approach to making sure that all 7th and 8th graders have it as a requirement. So some states have gone that path. Certainly not something I don't think Colorado would do, is to mandate it. But it comes down to the differences and nuances between states and their level of local control and their desire to have local control and enabling certain activities to happen, rather than setting up a statewide curriculum that would actually put in place very clear accountability metrics and all of those things and requirements for it to happen. So there is certainly differences between states and their level of interest in doing mandates versus local control efforts, but some of them have been pretty successful.
That's great. And I'm curious, since we have a room full of education wonks here that are going to take this information back to their states, what advice would you give anyone who wants to implement a middle school career pathways in their schools or in their districts or states? Happy to hear from both of you.
I think it's really hearing from all of the folks that are impacted and related. We had some human-centered design sessions with students, and we were able to better understand who the messenger should be, what the message would be, literally what time of year is the most helpful for them to hear these messages during the kind of traditional school year. And so now we're able to take that and able to update our career advising framework work and our trainings based on that. So I think it's really hearing from stakeholders.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I mean, I think the student-centered design was something that was kind of woven throughout our process. I do think it's also trying to connect the dots in terms of what employers are going to need. One of the things that we've been involved in as the Workforce Development Board is sort of saying, where are the jobs going to be? And then how do we kind of backward map to the middle grades as well as high schools? And we do a pretty poor job. Maybe labor market information might be better in Colorado, but our labor market information is often looking backwards. And there is a bevy of new, exciting industries that folks don't even know about. Like there's on the University of Delaware campus, there's gene editing that high school and middle school kids can go check out. So I think part of it is, yes, hear from the bottom up in terms of what stakeholders from students through to educators and employers need and want. But it's really sort of trying to connect the dots and seeing if you can kind of build a coherent system from top to bottom. And so I think that's going to be involved in ideally trying to build more of a demand-driven system that really reflects the needs of employers.
But to Danielle's point, some of that is driven by skills, right? So you might not necessarily need to know what jobs are available, but you will need to know what skills the employers are looking towards. And those tend to be fairly standard, right? There's America Succeeds said, durable skills, 70% of them show up in all job postings. So really thinking about how we're training young people for those durable skills that will be there regardless of what job someone might be creating in the future, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, we interviewed 300 employers in Delaware, and they basically said exactly what you said. Like, they need those durable skills and digital literacy. And then they can teach them the technical skills beyond that.
Great. I think we have a few final minutes. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to close out with? Each of you, I'd love to hear from you.
Sure. I mean, I can start. I think this is a great start of a conversation. Clearly, the research and data that's out there shows that these are conversations that are beginning to happen in states throughout the country, that educators are certainly focusing on this, that, as you say, employers are desperate for understanding how we're developing a pipeline of future workers, and that there is a lot of room for improvement when we think about how the policy is actually translating into the schools, and how do we make this really sustainable, really work for students in a way that it is not currently, and provide them with the hands-on learning experiences that will really teach them the skills that they need to be workforce ready.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of hit on a lot of the key issues around sort of the design strategy. I love, the longitudinal data system is very consistent with what we're trying to do because we have a K-12 system that's very good. We have a higher ed system that's decent, and then trying to really connect to with what kids do later on is a challenge. So connecting those dots is hugely important. I'd say, one thing that we didn't really talk about, and we talked about it a little bit in the prep, was that there is this huge federal opportunity right now. That there's literally $2 trillion that are in the ecosystem that are going towards semiconductor development, like the CHIPS work, the bipartisan infrastructure law, et cetera, WIOA, et cetera. There's a ton of money out there. And I think if you're thinking about sort of taking things to scale, I think getting creative about how do you braid your resources and create a coherent strategy that sort of pulls on multiple federal dollars. There's a lot out there. And I think a lot of our state agencies are overwhelmed with actually how to do that. And if you as an intermediary potentially, or a state agency, can help folks navigate that, there is a rich set of resources that can be drawn upon.
I was going to say something similar. We definitely collaborate a ton at the state level in Colorado, and different state agencies. We're aware of the funding sources. We do try to blend and braid as much as possible. Also, there's a year when somebody might not be able to afford to pay XYZ amount into the online platform, but another state agency can, and so we've got interagency agreements going, and I think we really do understand that, like all Coloradans, that's who we're all trying to serve. And so being aware, though, of what those funding sources are, other funding opportunities, we have agreement that if there is a funding opportunity available that's a competitive grant, like we come together and decide together, is it a go or a no-go? Because we know it's going to take each other to really make it successful. So I think, just like meeting folks and making sure you're kind of up to date on what everybody is doing, no matter what kind of like sphere or level you're at, is super helpful, because sometimes folks have something available and they don't even necessarily know that you've got that need. So being able to express the need and sharing is fantastic.
Well, great, and thank you all for your comments. I think we're at 1 minute, but Julie, I want to close out with where can everyone here find the research?
So it's available on our website today, www.asa.org.
Perfect.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so much.
all. It was a great conversation.